To me, success is marrying your path, your decisions with the highest utilization of your unique talent stack. So paradoxically, you can be in the middle of a catastrophic failure moment that shapes you and joins you with your calling journey in such a way where, in retrospect, it actually is the biggest moment of your success.
Welcome to the Better Human Podcast. My name is Greg Witz, and each week we're going to be bringing you some incredible and inspiring guests and topics that are going to take your life to the next level. Thanks for spending time with us. Sit back and enjoy the show. All right, welcome to today's episode. We have got the one and only Andrew Thorp King, who's an executive fintech banker, spy novelist, which we'll learn a little bit about later. Definitely a speaker and a punk rocker. This dude has got a history and a background from everywhere. He's got a podcast coming out. He's an ex-bodybuilder, and he's a serial entrepreneur. And we're going to be talking about failure today. I mean, as an entrepreneur, that's the one thing I know the most, which is how to fail. And it's, in fact, we might say probably something that I've done in everything before something's become successful. And a lot of people, as we know, have a massive issue with failure, right? I don't know why it is. They're so sensitive to failure. So, Andrew, we're going to get into this, my man. Once again, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. Can't wait to unpack this all with you.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about your book, and you're going to give us your tips and the rules for failure, and hopefully a little bit of guidance on what we could do to be more successful in 2023. So with that, Andrew, let's get into it.
Sounds great. Let's get into it. Where do you want to start?
Awesome. Well, let's start with failure rules. So your book, The 5 Rules of Failure for Entrepreneurs, Creatives, and Authentics, right? Tell us a little bit about where this book began for you. There it is. I just ordered it, by the way. I got your copy of the book, but I just ordered it on Amazon as well. We got to support that, right?
Appreciate it. So
tell me, where did this all begin for you? Like, where did the book begin, and sort of how did you come up with this topic?
It happened in a time of my life where, after my 20s and 30s, were just littered with what seemed to be near catastrophic failure after near catastrophic failure. Most of them driven by entrepreneurial off-road adventuring, right? Which is, just intrinsic in my soul, intrinsic in my way of being, intrinsic in my nature. And I was just wondering, what is going on? What is the value I'm going to extract from this? I mean, obviously, the first rule of failure, the unspoken, the kind of, self-evident rule of failure is try not to fail, try to avoid it, right? So this is not a book that is, dedicated to failure porn. It's not meant to be worshiping the twisted altar of self-indulgent failure. It's more of a sober, prudent, forward-looking, premeditative look of how we can think about failure before it strikes, how we can think about the failures that are unavoidable, but can also be leveraged and optimized to be a key part of our story and to be something that kind of molds us in a crucible, much like author Nassim Taleb talks about, where the failure itself ends up being something that harms us, but we gain from that harm, like the hydra that multiplies and gains from harm, I was taking a beach walk. I had just gone through a business divorce from a partnership in an online lending company that I was in for 4 years that, was really, I had a lot of passion for. It was very interesting, but it was tumultuous from the get-go. A lot of things happened during those 4 years, and my partner and I kind of reached this situation where the communication template wasn't working, and I had exited. This caused some reorganization in my financial life. I still had other income streams, but it was the core income. I had to make a lot of decisions to kind of reorganize things. And it did represent a failure in some ways. And I had to figure out how I was going to reorganize my life. I was also on the precipice of what I pretty much knew at that point was the road to a marital divorce. So you got business divorce on one hand, marital divorce on the other hand. So you have these kind of twin pillars of failure forces hovering around my consciousness. I'm on this beach walk, and I'm thinking about what were the strengths, what were the insights, what were the inspiration points that helped carry me through my 20s and my 30s as I'm, at the end of my 30s at this point, to get me through these failure points. What was it all kind of culminating towards, right? And I'm an old punk rocker, so I got the headphones on. I'm listening to music. I'm listening to a playlist, songs by the Cro-Mags, Hard Times, singer for the Cro-Mags, John Joseph, who's an author, triathlete, Hare Krishna devotee. He wrote the foreword to this book, which I'm grateful to. I was listening to Ace of Spades by Motorhead, those two songs, along with a quote by Winston Churchill, which was, "Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm." Those things kind of were like hovering in my mind. And I just thought about how it really was the endorphin of the spirit, which was enthusiasm, which carried me through constantly from these failures and helped me learn and grow from them and actually gain from the harms of them. And I just felt convicted among other decisions I made that day. Like, I mean, I made all kinds of decisions to repurpose businesses, to take on strategic debt for investment purposes, to pursue a new career in formal banking space, to finish my spy novel. All these things came to my mind that day, were kind of in the stew basket of ideas that emerged from leveraging that chaos. But then the overarching thing was I felt convicted to write this book on the value of failure. That was 2013. Here we are in 2022. It finally comes out after, many drafts, iterations, editing, all of that. And I've now come to kind of build what I call the failure verse around the idea, to try to evangelize the message in as many ways as possible. From YouTube videos to an adjacent merchandise company, the book, going to do speaking events, all of that stuff, all the things you do to get a message out. And that really was the genesis. And from there, it just could have sort of evolved.
Right. So basically 9-10 years to get the book out, right?
Yes. I mean, in the interim, obviously, like all kinds of life changes. I got remarried. I moved many times. I was involved in different businesses. Wrote another spy novel that hadn't come out, which kind of took time away from this book. But when I pivoted back to this during the pandemic, I really felt the flow state and just the momentum come in. It really was the pandemic that helped me finish it, because we're on lockdown. I was going to use that to my advantage. One of the chapters here is leverage chaos as an idea engine. So I leveraged the chaos of the pandemic as an idea engine. And on the weekends and evenings, man, I would just get into these flow states for hours and hours. I was just dumping words and words and words onto the page, drinking black coffee after black coffee, just like Henry Rollins would sing in Black Flag, and just pouring onto the page. And I got it done. And, I read about in the book the idea of flow states, and how it's more important to cultivate the conditions that facilitate flow states more than just blunt force work ethic. And I think that's something that really came to me during the write of this book. I mean, it peeled off me with ease as I got into it. There was no real forcefulness. It was just block everything out, put brackets around that space, forget about everything else in your life, and just go. Put on the music, pour the coffee, pour the bourbon, depending on the time of day, light up the cigar, and get into the flow state and see what the muse has to tell you.
Amazing. All right, I want to go back to a couple of things. You dropped some things in. I want to get you to expand upon them. So one, entrepreneurial off-roading. I love that. I'm an entrepreneur, man. Like, I think my success has been built on fucking it up or failing first, right? I mean, I don't know how to, in some cases, create a strategic plan, right? For me, it's just like, all right, well, let's go do this. Let's create that. Let's go sell that. Let's go build that. Let's go do that. And I'll put it out there. And, in some cases it fails. In fact, we might even argue 99% of the time it doesn't work out. And it's like, okay, well, that didn't work. Well, what are we going to do next? And what are we going to do next? And what are we going to do next? And that's where we've built. I mean, that's how I've built my success in sales. That's how I've built my success in the business. That's how we've developed new products and new initiations. Was all through just this exercise. I mean, the podcast was a perfect example. If you listen to the first 3 or 4 episodes, it sounds like a complete catastrophe, right? But I want to come back, because at that time in your life, when you were going through a divorce with your business partnership and marital as well, I mean, they say when it rains, it pours, right? Yeah. So what was the breakdown of your business relationship and your marital relationship, and were they similar?
Yeah, I think it's just, it really did stem from, my orientation in the world up until that point, and both from necessity and from congruence with who I was, chasing after entrepreneurial paths, right? Mm-hmm. So I got married very young, had a young family, quickly found out that working for other people was not really going to give me either the meaning or the money I needed to satisfy myself or to take care of my family. So both by necessity and because it is also my nature, I began doing entrepreneurial things. So starting with, being laid off from working as a collections rat for Ford Credit right after I got married. I was unemployed, delivering pizzas. And in that failure space, in that emptiness, I could hear my internal spirit voice, right? Which is a term I define in the book, where if you're aligned with it, you're actually then maximizing your authentic, way of being in the world. And, I decided to, almost blindly, but I don't regret it, max out my credit cards and start my first record label. That created a series of difficulties and hardship and learning curves, but at the same time, it took me on that path. I ended up then meeting what was then the VP of Relapse Records. I would say, not randomly, I would say almost providentially, one night working out in the gym, ended up then working at Relapse Records, running their wholesale department, getting a paid education in the music business while running my record labels at night. And over the years later, after many failures and issues, I now have 2 record labels. I've released over 120 records. It's a great kind of portfolio of IP rights that kind of churns in the background of my other pursuits. By day, I'm a fintech banker. It was really, that was kind of the beginning. But along the way, there was really hard times where I had lost it all, gained it back, lost it all, gained it back. And that volatility takes a toll on those who don't understand the entrepreneurial soul, don't understand the sensibility of an entrepreneur. And for those that are sometimes irrationally to the detriment of their own maximization of their talents, attached to a notion of safety. So failure rule number 2 is nothing is safe, right? And that was one of the things that kind of was overarching that I had learned throughout my career and my off-road entrepreneurial adventuring. That's now kind of a core awareness, a core value of mine. And that became failure rule number 2, stemmed from a quote from Lemmy from Motorhead, where he was talking about how nothing is safe after one of his shows got canceled after the terrorist attack in the UK at the Ariana Grande concerts. And I wrote 27 chapters around that premise of nothing is safe.
Wow. Okay. So that's what you mean by entrepreneurial off-roading. Like, we go off into this adventure. We don't know where we're going. We're in the middle of it. The roads get bumpy. We're navigating the terrain as we're going. And that is the thing that's going to actually start to build us, build success, right? We might not stick that answer out, and we might not stick that play out, but we're going to be able to keep going. And you're right. For people that are not entrepreneurs, to keep up with this chaos is a little scary. I mean, a lot of people look for psychological safety, and back to rule 2, I mean, nothing is safe, right? So.
No, that's right. Yeah, and they do look for that. And to your point, when you talk about success, I actually define success probably a little differently in the book, in my definition of the term. So for me, success is not necessarily attached to, obviously attainment of stability, material wealth, or even, accomplishment or attribution. Although those things are great, right? And they can be byproducts of success. But to me, success is marrying your path, your decisions, with the highest utilization of your unique talent stack, right? So paradoxically, you can be in the middle of a catastrophic failure moment that shapes you and joins you with your calling journey in such a way where, in retrospect, it actually is the biggest moment of your success, right? So I have a chapter in the book called Get Used to Unsafe Spaces, and it's about the life of Johnny Cash. And I think about how he walked away from the job offer to be a salesman from his first father-in-law when he's married to Vivian Liberto, the old, hello, I'm Johnny Cash, knocking on the door. He walked away from that safety, which would have been a spiritual prison to him. He might have had the external facade of safety had he done it, but he probably would have been dying inside because he had something to give the world, right? But then by following his calling journey into music, it did bring him into the chaos of addiction, of tragedy, of divorce, of all these negative things. But they also were the things that shaped his music, that gave him depth, and that ultimately gave the full narrative of his life and his music more meaning and more power on the redemptive end of the curve when he lived his act 2. So I think of those stories, and that was success for him, even though it was riddled with failures. Right. What might have been viewed as success, the safe path, likely would have resulted in him kind of living out the Thoreau quote of living a quiet life of desperation.
Right. A zombie.
Yeah.
Right, just walking through. Okay, so that's what you mean by like this catastrophe, this chaos of failure, right? We got to go through all of this, call it the mess, the jungle, right? In order to come out the other side, to really be able to move forward successfully and to carve and to create, our path.
That's right. Yeah. And to kind of caveat that a little bit, it does not mean that you intentionally go into, you know, chaos or, off-road paths in a stupid way. You still want to plan them. So I have failure rule number 4, which is the thing 1 and thing 2 dependency. Thing 1 and thing 2 has nothing to do with the cat in the hat. In my mind, I more envision, disheveled Tony Soprano waking up with his white bathrobe, lighting the first cigar of the day and saying, hey, you got the thing 1 and thing 2 dependency here, right? So really what it is thing 1 is your enabler pursuit. And thing 2 is your North Star aspirational dream pursuit. And the thing 1 enabler is really whatever scaffolding, undergirding, support you build to help you more safely go towards the thing 2 North Star pursuit. Still knowing that nothing is safe, but you still want to effectuate reasonable safety when you can within your reach, while not ignoring the necessity of trying to marry money and meaning and chasing that North Star dream pursuit.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so you've been mentioning the rules for failure. Let's just break them down in order. So rule number 1 is?
Failure rule number 1 is failure purifies. It's the idea of the phoenix, really. The phoenix must burn to emerge, right? You have to burn off old thinking for new thinking to thrive. Old ways of being need to be burned off for new ways of being to emerge and grow.
Love that. Love that. That's kind of what I was talking about before. You got to go through that jungle, right? But your analogy is the phoenix, right? Yeah, we got to rise from ashes, right? And it's, it's also interesting. I was telling you, I've been living in Costa Rica, and like during the dry season, the entire mountain burns. Like when we were here last year, it was actually scary. The whole place is on fire, right? And I'm looking at friends and like, the fucking place is on fire. And they're like, oh no, it's cool. It happens every year.
Right. Yeah, it's normal.
Yeah, this is normal for you. The road's on fire, the mountain's on fire, trees are burning. Some guy said to me, he said, if you notice, it's windy during dry season. So what it does is it blows the fire and it just burns the brush. But the most incredible thing happens afterwards is what that does to the soil and the growth and the vegetation that comes through that. So love that. So rule 1 is like, we got to burn before we could grow, right?
That's right.
Rule 2.
Like I said, failure rule number 2 is nothing is safe. So it's just the idea of not attaching yourself to some sort of safety first mentality. I kind of go through the example in the book of Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs. He had an episode called Safety Third, which didn't really mean you need to make safety third arbitrarily, but just meant we should not make safety first all the time when there's competing values that often ought to be evaluated that should supersede and make safety subordinate to them. So, I kind of go through the meaning of that and how, if safety is your highest value, you're probably living a small life. You're probably not living the life that you were meant to live, and you're not actualizing yourself most likely. And again, it doesn't mean that we take unnecessary risk. I mean, that's not the point. There is balance here, right?
For sure.
That's failure rule number 2 is nothing is safe.
Right. And the truth to it, in some cases, what I think you're also describing is that safety is a perception, right? People want to live in their little bubble and they want to stay there, and they perceive that it's safe, but you're not going to achieve anything until you push off that carpet. I talk a lot about that when it comes down to building your confidence, which is, we all live on a carpet. Picture your carpet, right? And every time you walk to the edge, right, it gets a little scary and it's a little bit of a risk, but if you step off that carpet, your carpet might just get bigger, right? So awesome. So, right, no safety in this stuff. Rule 3.
Failure rule number 3 is money is spiritual. It's really about the idea of avoiding the failure edges of both greed and envy, and trying to find a way to marry money and meaning and use money in the most highest way possible as a thank you note, because place value is measured thankfulness. And when we engage in transactions, essentially transactions are for the most part voluntary. Both sides believe they're going to win, even if they're not, in order to engage in them. And it's about trying to find a way to make the other side win as much as you, and using money as kind of the agnostic tool that it is, that if you use it properly, it can really be an instrument of blessing, a force multiplier of value and prosperity. And it can be something that, can really lift you out of failure spaces, right? And, it's a tool that, I think of those who might be in a disadvantaged position from an economic standpoint, and how they view money in those spaces is very important. If you view the world as against you, as your opportunity as completely limited and shut off, and that, rich people are against you, or those that have done well are your enemy and you're envious of them, it's not going to serve you. If you realize that there is flexibility and mobility from an economic standpoint, then you can find ways to learn from those that have viewed money correctly and use it correctly yourself to help lift yourself out of poverty. And I've experienced this in my own life. I've gone from wild shifts in my economic situation from viewing money as the powerful spiritual tool that it can be. And so failure rule number 3 is money is spiritual.
Okay, so just give me an example of how you've done that. So, what are you doing personally to live that?
So, I would say it brings me back to the time I lived in the Midwest. I had transitioned my record labels from being a full-time effort to being kind of a managed IP rights kind of situation because I had gotten in financial trouble and I needed to recoup. I ended up then starting a financial planning business. It was still kill or be killed. I had no guaranteed salary. I was building up a clientele. It takes about 5 years or so for most financial planners to really build a sustainable practice. I was 2 years in the Midwest, in the Auto Belt, Toledo, Ohio, close to Detroit. As goes Detroit, so goes Toledo. 2008 financial crisis hit. Accounts are being closed out. My practice is diminishing. I'm working day and night as hard as I ever did. Appointments all day, all night. Sales cycles are long. Nothing's popping. Income's dwindling. And I was in a really, really bad spot. But it was at that time that I realized, well, how am I going to get out of this? I had to think about adjacent possibles. What can I look to next that might be adjacent that I could fall into? And who are those that are doing well, that have done well with money? And how can I find ways to shadow them, learn from them, become a mentee of them to get out of this? And it was through that type of networking mentality where I began to surround myself with successful people and eventually found my way into the online lending business and really became very, very, very prosperous in that before I ultimately hit turbulence there. But even then, again, I found my way into the adjacent possible, started my own lead generation business. That ended up having parity with what at the same time was a new career in fintech banking. So it's just this mentality that viewing those that have done well and have learned how to use money as mentors and finding a way to or it could be virtual mentors too. So it's just having that belief that you can find a way to use that tool to help you ascend.
Cool. And you're right. There's so many people that grow up with a specific mindset about money, and it becomes a huge limiting belief for them, right? And I love what you're talking about. You want to play with better golfers. You want to surround yourself with better players. You want to play up, not play down. And it's this type of mentorship and guidance that's gonna contribute to that. Awesome. All right, let's get into rule 4 and rule 5.
So failure rule number 4, like I kind of alluded to before, is that thing 1 and thing 2 dependency. So it's about building that kind of connection between a thing 1 enabler pursuit, which might be a low meaning pursuit, might be dispassionate, but it is the thing that gives you the headroom and the flexibility to, on your own time, kind of push a side hustle or a thing 2 aspirational North Star dream pursuit into reality. So I go through some very creative case studies on thing 1 and thing 2. There was 2 brothers I knew who I anonymized in the book that they were of a Lebanese Shia Muslim background. They came here from Lebanon. They believed that starting their own businesses was the path to prosperity in America. They didn't have any cash. So what they did is they ended up working for Disney on Ice, who paid for their lodging, paid for all their food. So they had no expenses. They lived on the road. They were married to the road for several years. Every day, someone swagged to the mothers of little girls from Princesses, Disney on Ice, all that. Saved up the cash for that seed money. Ended up then starting basically a mini retail portfolio empire in the Midwest, where they own gas stations and cigar lounges and gyms and even strip clubs. And that's how they did it. No formal education. It was this creative thing, one enabler of Disney on Ice that then birthed this thing to dream of sustaining themselves as business owners with the retail portfolio. And so it's that type of creative mentality, almost this punk rock circumvention, that you're going to find a way to link one thing to build another thing. And it's also a way to kind of mitigate the reality of failure rule number 2, nothing is safe.
Cool. Love that. Love that. Right. And rule 5, cap it off for us.
Failure rule number 5, which I've had a lot of conversations on podcasts on how this might be the cardinal rule, is failure rule number 5 is you are not your failures, right? So we start off with failure purifying you in that empty space where failure might make you feel like you're not worth anything, you don't have any value. But if you view it correctly, you actually can discover that new value, that renewed, enhanced, exponentially better value. Failure rule number 5 caps it off with you are not your failures. Do not attach your identity to your failures. Detach yourself from the optics of failure. So I think of one example I read about in the book, Elgin James, who's a mixed race kid, grew up in the Boston punk rock hardcore scene. He's actually he's the half brother of Jocko Willink. He played in a hardcore punk band with Jocko Willink before Jocko Willink became Jocko Willink. So he's Jocko's half brother. And Elgin ended up being the leader of a violent street gang called FSU, which alternately meant Friends Stand United and Fuck Shit Up. And FSU became very notorious for going around punk clubs, in the early 2000s, and they were a straight edge, hardcore, gang, which meant they didn't drink, they didn't do drugs, and they really were against anybody that did. And they went around at first being violent and beating up, those that did drugs or drank, but then eventually it got a little more malevolent, and they were kind of having random violence. So it was very negative. But then Elgin, at one point, turned away from that violence. He then, kind of found his calling, moved to LA with his girlfriend, and pursued screenwriting. Through that kind of resurrection, he learned to, atone for his past, detach from that, still embrace a new identity, a new way of being, maximize his usefulness in the world. He ended up befriending Robert Redford. He ended up writing the screenplay for Lowriders, the movie, and then eventually worked with Kurt Sutter and worked on Mayans MC, which was a spin-off to Sons of Anarchy. In the midst of that, he still got sentenced for some extortion work when he was in the gang. And on the day of sentencing, with letters to the judge from Robert Redford, he, talked about how the paradox of that day, because on that day, he got signed to a deal with Universal Pictures the same day he was getting sentencing. So it was this juxtaposition of his old life with his new life. But in the end, his story really is about detaching from your failures of your past while still facing the consequences, because failures are still messy. You still have consequences to face, but you detach your identity and you still find a way to move forward into rebirth. And so that really, to me, is the crux of failure rule number 5. You are not your failures.
I love that. And it's so true what you just said. I think the big failure in quotations, what people in this particular case is, they will live that identity in that brand. They will live in the past. They will define themselves from things. And, it's interesting because, what do we know about neuroscience and neuroplasticity is that, we can basically build and develop new neurological connections, pathways, right? Which allows behavior and feelings and everything. So that basically says is an old dog can learn new tricks. In other words, we can actually change. We can change the way we feel, then behave. But it all begins with making, in some cases, is rule 5, which is making the decision to not let my failures define me or create my identity or my brand. It becomes part of, call it some, maybe the battle wounds that I've had to, the scars that I've gone through life. But scars are cool, right? specifically if you're a punk rocker.
That's right.
All right. Very cool. Very, very cool. All right. You know what I love about your story? I mean, first of all, you've defined entrepreneurial off-roading extremely well just through your own experience, which is jumping from one business to the next. I mean, you go from, financial planning to a record label to an author now to a speaker. Like, it's exciting, man. And, as you were just describing, it's all these new things have led from that thing one, thing two, right? Which is, I was doing this, but it was this that gave me the insight or the opportunity or the eyes or the experience or the exposure to this, right? Awesome. Look, I for me, failing is an easy thing. It's like, okay, next, right? Let's just go.
That's right.
And it's if you could take that mindset, which is what do I get to experience and learn from this? It's really part of it, right? Awesome. Okay, so entrepreneurs, we fail, we fuck it up, we keep doing it. How important is or should an entrepreneur have a backup plan just in case things aren't going well to thing one?
Absolutely. So I write about a portfolio pursuits mindset. I use kind of a quote from Gene Simmons from KISS where he talks about it's better to be an octopus than a fish because you have, 8 tentacles. If one is severed, you still have 7 left, right? So I've kind of embraced this in my life. I always have 3 or 4 kind of things in my immediate portfolio of pursuits that I'm tending to, right? Like, so right now I have Failure Rules the book. I'm a fintech banker by day. So my record label is turning in the background. And, it's kind of for 2 purposes, right? One is to have some sort of backup plan, like you say.
Right.
If one starts weaning, you lean on another. You always look for new things to add to the composite with an adjacent possible mentality. What might be right next to what you're doing now that might stretch you into a new territory? I think of Walt Disney, where he was failing from his early motion pictures, and he had a portfolio pursuits mentality. And guess what underwrote him to get him out of that hole was just this adjacent possible, where he decided to productize one piece of one character, Mickey Mouse, on a watch. The watch sales ended up financing his films, right? It wasn't his films that made money. It was the damn watch. But
Right.
he had that portfolio pursuits mentality. So it's taking that and applying that to your whole business life, but not just for financial stability, also for fulfillment, right? And if you build it in a proper way, the composite at any given time, as it's recalibrated, can give you 100% fulfillment. I found that in my own life, and I found an interconnectivity from one pursuit to another, where one can energize the other, from transposing skills from one to another. And to me, it's just part of living a rich life. And then it spills over to your personal life too, because you're happier.
Yeah, true. Hey, so sorry to interrupt, and thank you for listening. I hope you're enjoying the show. If you like today's episode and you want to learn more about some of our programs like the Better Leader program that can change your life, go ahead and click the link below. Man, how long did it take you to sort of develop this mindset?
I would say it really started crystallizing in my late 30s after that marital and business divorce. Having when I became divorced, I had a lot of alone time, and it was just an explosion of personal growth, of reading, of listening to podcasts, of synthesizing the experiences of my life, of planning, the next 5 to 10 years. It was really during that time period where I was able to articulate, mostly through writing this book, what I had learned and kind of what my, understood principles now were, and these 5 rules and the lessons that collapse underneath them became that framework.
Cool. Very cool. And that's something that you have to keep practicing, right?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I'll go through things on a day-to-day basis, and amongst, continually being an avid reader of all kinds of books, I'll look back at my own book now and I'll read a chapter like, oh yeah, I need to remember that. That's exactly what I need to invoke right now, right? So I wrote the book just as much for me as I did for anybody else, right? It's a reminder to me on how I need to remain oriented, and my own failures will most likely even extend to my ability to even follow the rules that I created here.
Right. But I mean, isn't that just how everything's sort of created? It takes us to go through this to then sort of document it. That's how my business was developed. So my father started the business, who was I describe him as a very tortured soul, very, insane personality. And in his search for peace, in his search for, the peace of mind, he developed the program, which was an interpersonal skills program originally focused on how to manage his temper, right? Which is,
Interesting.
what is the tool I can use to manage this sort of reaction, and what's the process I can go through? And today it's called the STOP concept, and it's a whole model, and it's a workbook that you work through. And
And that came from your father?
came from my father.
Interesting.
Because in his need to figure this out there and manage it, that just wasn't out there. And that's sort of where it all began, and teamed up with some psychologists, and that's how the content started to be grow. And today it's a full company that has, you know, different programs for corporate and individuals, right? But it all began through his effort to figure it out, right?
That's a failure rule story right there. That can make it in the next book. I mean, that's an amazing story. I mean, you're talking about someone dealing with their own inadequacies, staring in the face, potentially after, you know, maybe years of denial. I don't know.
Yep.
And then turning that into power and turning that into a framework to help and bless others. I mean, right. To me, that's failure rules right there.
Yeah. And the first rule in our world was there's no substitute for taking responsibility. Yeah. You got to own it. You got to be accountable. Right. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're failing or succeeding, winning or losing, moving left, moving right. You know, your impact, you have to take responsibility for. And that's where you talk about, you know, sometimes there's consequences, you know, to the failures, but it's about tackling them head on. Awesome. Let me ask you, I mean, we might argue that in today's world, if we don't have a sense of humor, right, going through this type of exercise or this path could be very difficult. How important do you think humor is in going through this process?
I think it's critical. It's just as critical as enthusiasm. I mean, enthusiasm is one endorphin to carry you through failures. I think humor is another. Right. Self-deprecating humor. Right. I mean, looking at your circumstances. You know, I have a line in the book where I say, sometimes you need to take yourself less seriously in order to seriously put your life back together again. And that encapsulates it. You know, so, I mean, there was times in my life where amidst the chaos and the failures, my humor just grew. You know, I remember at one point, like I was obsessed with the show Rescue Me with Dennis Leary, and I really related to that character. And it was that type of sharp failure humor, I call it, that really is one of the tools in my toolboxes. I write about Rodney Dangerfield in the book. I think he has kind of an iconic brand of failure humor. He was bullied as a kid for being Jewish. He, you know, went through depression and divorce. He was an aluminum siding salesman well into his, you know, I think, late 40s, maybe even. I don't remember the ages, before he really broke into comedy, you know, and I think his comedy was wrought from making fun of his own failures. And it was that strength and that power that brought him into the calling that made him who he was and who we remember. So I just think failure humor is just immensely important. Back in June, I went and saw Bill Burr do a comedy show with my son. And we were at the hotel. And after the show, my son spots Bill Burr in the lobby. He's got a hoodie on, he's almost hiding, but he was on stage talking about how he wanted a cigar afterwards. So I'm like, yo, man, did you get your cigar? He's like, no, meet me out back. So my son and I, we went out back, and at first he was talking to his opening act. It wasn't really near, so we gave him some space. But then eventually he came over and we were smoking a cigar together and talking. I was telling him a little about the book, telling him about failure humor. And he's like, failure humor? That's exactly what I do, you know? Right. And so it's like, even him, like, he instantly recognized that, yeah, failure humor, that's Bill Burr's brand, you know? So it's a term I kind of coined in the book, but I think it's very valuable for us to take our circumstances seriously, but not so seriously we're attaching our identity to it, and to be able to make fun of ourselves and to use humor to lighten that load and lubricate the way forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, I think humor and comedy and laughing and being enthusiastic and optimistic are core skills, practices, you know, things that we need to do. Look, as a presenter, as a trainer, as a facilitator, I have fucked up in front of the room many a times, right? And, you know, people still ask me today, 25 years into this, they'll be like, do you get nervous or do you get anxious before? I'm like, yes, of course. You know, there's the anxiousness or the nerves are to which are good because, you know, it puts us on alert and to make sure that we're intentional and we're going into this with 100. But man, I can't tell you how many times I've dropped in the room and just worked so hard through that. And it's disappointing, right? But you got to laugh at it a little bit, man. You got to laugh and kick back and be like, all right, Next, let's move on, right? What are we going to take from this? And
Yeah,
that
it goes back to also wabi-sabi, which is a term I talk about in the book, embracing wabi-sabi, which is defined by David Lee Roth from Van Halen as, it's perfect because it's a little fucked up, and it's embracing that imperfection and finding the beauty in that. And then,
right.
integrating that also into our mindset and way of being as we move forward and try to do bold and difficult things.
Cool. And this kind of goes back to being authentic. I mean, which might be a little difficult. So let me ask you, what does being authentic, even in the face of failure, mean to you?
So again, I think authentic for me, and it's almost, I use it as a noun, like you can be authentic. I kind of define that in the book. I think it's a spectrum because we're always kind of evolving in trying to marry ourselves with our authenticity. But I think to me, it's really, if you're listening to that internal spirit voice and you are following that to chase the things that burn deep inside you that you ought to be chasing, even if they're difficult, even if they're unsafe. If you're doing that and you're finding your way to join yourself with your calling journey, you're going to be finding your authentic self. So I think of an example in the book, Jack Johnson, the legendary boxer, and how he navigated the waters of social Darwinism and cultural racism, and really just use bravado and his authenticity to just rebel against that and become an amazing boxer and defy kind of the social constructs of the time. To me, he's kind of an example of an authentic. So that's one example. But I do think that it's a bit of a difficult thing to put your finger on. But it when you're living it.
Right.
I've known it when I've not been authentic,
Right.
and when I am authentic, I feel the most aligned with, my trajectory, my place in the world.
Yeah. No, I think it's so important.
How do you think of the word authentic?
So I think of the authentic, I kind of describe it like this. This is me. You get what you get, right? I curse, I swear, I have tattoos. I dropped out of high school. I run this business. I am an open book. You want to know my story? You want to ask me a question? I'm as transparent as I get. And I think the reason for that is I hold authenticity at such a high value, right? Because my buddy says this, and he described it this way. He says, what's really sexy and nice about people that have an opinion? And I said, what? He says, you know who they are, right? Yeah. And that's kind of being authentic, which is, are we willing to be brave enough and express our ideas, our opinions, our thoughts, to create dialogue and debate, not to attack, but how can you stay true to that? And it's very important that we express these things. We express our values, we express our needs, we express our opinions, we express our thoughts and ideas, because without that, right, we don't have the insight to the other. And the more insight that I have to you, in some cases, it will reinforce you being authentic, right? Because you get to be your natural self. So if I was to sort of sum it up in one description, it's being your natural self.
I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, another example I use in the book is founder of Victory Records, Tony Brummel, dropped out of high school, 17, no college degree, no family wealth, no resume, only had $800, started Victory Records, ended up exiting with a $34 million sale in 2020, but built that record label without the formal education, without the seed money, without the help, dropped out of high school. And he was known for being just this aggressive, somewhat abrasive businessman. But you talk to the guy, you walk away with energy. You might even be a little offended, but you love the guy and he's authentic. And even if you don't love him, he's authentic and you appreciate it. And it's like those type of characters, those type of stories is what I think of sometimes when I think of someone being authentic.
When I know those personalities very well, I am one. My father was one. At the core of those very abrasive, aggressive personalities, what if you actually really start to see who they are in their authentic selves, they really care, right?
Yes.
They're very deep, caring individuals, right? The delivery might be a little bit like sandpaper.
That's right.
But the need to do it, because the truth to it is people that get aggressive are passionate and care, right? Because if they didn't care, if they weren't involved, if they weren't committed, be no reason to get angry, right?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, they care. Tony Brummel, he has a quote where he says, "When I die on my tombstone, I wanted to say, He was a crazy motherfucker that gave a shit and wanted to win.
Right.
He's talking about caring. He's talking about the passion. He's talking about caring about the music, you know, and
Right.
that was his abrasive, aggressive personality, which rubbed some people the wrong way, but got results and others, you know, deeply appreciated.
Mm-hmm. You know, I should have asked you this earlier, but where did music come into your life? I mean, where was it? How it's such
always
an
by my
important piece
side.
to who you are, right? I mean, punk
Yeah.
rocker, record label owner. I mean, you've been
Yeah.
around music forever. You quote it. It's in your book.
Yep.
So, do you know where this all began for you? It's just been part of your life forever.
I mean, you know, being in 7th and 8th grade, you know, hanging out with skateboarders and riding my BMX bike and, you know, looking a little different and, you know, sometimes getting picked on by the quote unquote jocks of the day, and then getting that first cassette tape where I hear, you know, Murphy's Law or Black Flag or, you know, I'm hearing the Sex Pistols or whatever, just the rawness and just the kind of like, fuck you, I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to be myself. I don't give a shit what you say kind of attitude. To me, there's a through line straight from punk rock to entrepreneurialism, to being authentic, to even kind of the sovereignty of individuality, and even, you know, dare I say, adjacent to libertarian thought. Like there's just a through line through all of that for me. And so punk rock was the genesis of kind of who I've evolved to be, you know, over the decades. And it all came from discovering it when I was like in middle school.
Listen, punk has been around forever. I mean, punk is a huge thread and piece to music, right? I mean, it's iconic. Anyway, that's a conversation for another time, or maybe your next book. All right. At the end of the episode, we come to the most important question, which is, what is the better human question? Which is, what do you think we could all do to be better humans tomorrow?
Yeah. So thinking about failure and thinking about detaching from the optics of failure, leveraging chaos as an idea engine. To me, being a better human is finding a way in all circumstances to embrace some sort of framework of non-attachment, regardless of what, you know, faith expression that might come from or non-faith expression like Stoicism, but embracing non-attachment and holding loosely the external things in your life while still trying to optimize and shape them and maximize them for enjoyment, but knowing that you need to first hold tight to those internal attachments. And that, I think, will make you a better human, make you kinder, make you more grounded, and make you just more fulfilled as you walk through this unsafe world.
Amazing. Love that. All right, let's drop some of your information. Where can the audience find you if they want to book you as a speaker? Obviously, we could get your book on Amazon.
Sure.
Failure Rules, the 5 rules of failure for entrepreneurs, creatives, and authentics. We're definitely going to drop all that information into the show notes. But where else can we find you?
Everything is at ANDREWTHORPKING.com. There's no E on the end of Thorpe. I would encourage everybody to sign up for my free Failure Rules mini course, where you get kind of distilled, snackable nuggets from the book, from each rule in your inbox, and then ongoing failure wisdom thereafter. So sign up for that, get a flavor. You'll also be able to go through my website to get linked to my YouTube channel, where I have a number of produced videos, kind of bringing the themes of the book alive in a different way. There's a merch section with my merch company, Soul on Fire Supply Company, which also links to themes in the book. Some kick-ass merch there. And there's also a soundtrack for the book on Spotify and Apple Music with some key tunes that I rocked while I was writing the book.
Amazing. So the stuff that you were listening to, not
that's right.
Cool.
Not just listening to, but the songs that actually really helped buoy me through some of these hard times.
Oh, that's amazing. You know, as you said that, I thought of the Pink Floyd album with the Wizard of Oz. They sync up, right? So this album, this track, this album that you got on Spotify syncs up with the book. Very cool. All right, my man. Well, this has been a pleasure. You know, to the audience, go check out Andrew Thorp King. Get him on Instagram. Check out his website, which is ANDREWTHORPKING.com. And Thorp is THORP King.com. Sign up for his membership, and definitely drop some likes and some subscribes to his channel as well. You got a podcast as well, right? Why don't you tell us about the podcast? I don't yet. It's in the works. It'll probably be launched towards the end of next year, but it's coming. Okay, so podcast is coming. Podcast is coming, and I want to be a guest on your show. Absolutely. All right. To the audience, if you like today's episode, don't forget to like it, subscribe to it, share it, and again, check out Andrew Thorp King. Andrew, thank you. You're a gem. You're a better human. Really appreciate today. Greg, thank you so much. Have a great day, man. Hey, thanks for listening today. And if you enjoyed today's episode, you're going to love the next one.